The city knew him as a man who had everything: wealth that glittered in every corner of his mansion, a fleet of cars that announced his arrival before he stepped out, and an empire that bowed to his decisions. On the surface, his life was the very image of perfection, a carefully constructed illusion that made strangers envy him and associates admire him. Yet behind the gold and glamour, within the walls of his opulent home, cracks had already begun to spread in the foundation of his marriage. Once, he had adored his wife. She had been the quiet, steady presence who grounded his restless ambition, the woman whose soft laughter had filled his evenings with warmth, and whose loyalty had never once wavered even as his empire expanded. In their early years, he held her hand in public, spoke of her as his pride, and watched her with eyes that carried love instead of distance. But time, temptation, and whispers of flattery pulled his gaze elsewhere. The mistress entered like perfume, sweet, intoxicating, and subtle in her poison. She played her role cleverly, making him believe he deserved more excitement than a wife who lived simply and carried his child. He began to listen less to his wife, and more to the woman who fed his ego. What once was love slowly transformed into cold indifference. The wife, carrying the weight of her unborn child, felt each shift in his behavior like a blade to her heart. She never confronted him, never raised her voice, but her silence spoke volumes. She endured the loneliness with dignity, refusing to shed tears where anyone could see, but in the quiet of the night, she pressed a hand to her stomach and prayed her child would never feel the same betrayal she bore in silence. She entered their lives not with thunder but with silk, smooth words, a dazzling smile, and eyes that promised adventure. The mistress was everything the wife was not in the eyes of the millionaire, bold where his wife was reserved, extravagant where she was simple, loud where she was soft. To the world, she appeared as nothing more than a charming friend, someone who offered light conversation at dinners and brought laughter into business gatherings. She knew how to charm a room, slipping her hand onto his arm in ways that seemed innocent, smiling at his wife with just enough sweetness to make it look genuine. Yet behind closed doors, her true nature unfurled like a venomous flower. Ambition burned in her like a fever. She wanted more than stolen moments. She wanted the wife's place, the mansion, the title, and the man himself. She played her role like a seasoned actress, pouring honey in the millionaire's ear about how neglected he was, how dull stability had become. And when the wife was alone, the mask slipped. Her words, sharp and cruel, cut deeper than any knife. She would glance at the wife's growing belly and smirk, whispering that pregnancy had stolen her beauty, that she looked tired, bloated, and unworthy of standing beside a man of such stature. Sometimes, she laughed openly, comparing herself to the wife in ways meant only to humiliate, her figure, her youth, her liveliness. The wife bore it silently, lowering her gaze but never bowing her spirit. She knew what the mistress wanted, but her dignity would not allow her to trade insults. Still, the cruelty left invisible bruises on her heart. When she tried to express the pain to her husband, he brushed it aside with an impatient wave, calling her words exaggerations, her emotions fragile overreactions of pregnancy. Each dismissal carved the distance wider. The mistress smiled, victorious in her little victories, while the wife felt herself pushed further into shadows within her own home. The days stretched into a cruel routine where the wife's own home no longer felt like a sanctuary. The mistress moved through the mansion as though she owned it, her sharp tongue lashing out in ways that left invisible scars. She would make sly remarks at the breakfast table, commenting on how slowly the wife moved, how her swollen ankles and pale face made her look more like a servant than a lady of the house. When guests visited, the mistress ensured the wife was sidelined, speaking over her, mocking her opinions, and leaving her sitting quietly, humiliated in her own living room. Even the household staff, once loyal and protective, began bending to the mistress's will, fearing her sharp temper and her growing influence over the master of the house. Orders that once came from the wife were questioned, delayed, or ignored, leaving her powerless in the very place she was supposed to command respect. Her isolation grew heavier with each passing day. Friends stopped visiting, sensing the tension in the air. Family calls were brief, as she avoided sharing her pain to keep them from worrying. Alone in her room, she would press a trembling hand to her belly, whispering promises to the life inside her, telling her child that one day things would be better. Confrontation was a thought that crossed her mind often, but every time she considered standing up, the fear of stress harming her unborn child silenced her. She carried her dignity like armor, refusing to let the mistress see her break. But the heartbreak was constant, an ache that lingered even in her sleep. The millionaire watched all this, yet chose silence. When his wife's eyes sought his for protection, he looked away. He convinced himself it was easier to avoid conflict, that his wife was strong enough to endure small cruelties. But his silence was the deepest betrayal of all. Every unspoken word, every moment he failed to defend her, widened the chasm between them until his wife no longer looked at him with love but with quiet resignation, as if she already knew she had been abandoned long before the mistress arrived. The evening was meant to be one of prestige, a carefully curated gathering of business associates, family members, and influential friends who orbited around the millionaire's world. The grand hall was lit by chandeliers that spilled golden light across marble floors, and laughter mingled with the soft notes of a string quartet. The wife arrived quietly, dressed in a simple but elegant gown that draped over her rounded belly, her hands folded over the life she carried. She tried to hold her head high, hoping the night would pass without incident. But the mistress had already laid her trap. With a voice dripping in honey, the mistress gathered the guests' attention as she pretended to dote on the wife. "Isn't she brave," she cooed, "to be out tonight in her condition? Though, of course, I do wonder how she manages to fit into these dresses still." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, not cruel, but uncomfortable, the kind that left the wife shrinking under the weight of dozens of eyes. The mistress pressed further, reaching for a glass of wine and placing it teasingly in front of her. "Oh, I forgot, you can't enjoy anything fun these days. Poor thing. Sacrificing so much while others thrive." Her glance at the millionaire was deliberate, her smile triumphant. The wife's cheeks burned, but she stayed silent. She felt the sting of humiliation coil tightly in her chest, and when she dared look at her husband, she prayed he would speak, that he would rise to defend her honor. But he simply sipped his drink, his expression unreadable, pretending not to notice the cruelty unfolding before everyone's eyes. His silence was louder than the mistress's taunts. The wife lowered her gaze, tears brimming though she fought to keep them hidden. Her quiet suffering became a spectacle, a cruel performance for those who watched but dared not intervene. Yet in that moment of pain, something shifted inside her. She realized that this was not just a passing cruelty, this was her life unless she changed it. The man she once trusted had abandoned her in the most public, unforgivable way. As she blinked away her tears, she no longer thought only of enduring. She began to think of leaving, of walking away with her child and reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped from her. Her silence that night was no longer submission, it was the first step toward a decision that would change everything. The mistress's cruelty did not end with the humiliation at the party. It grew bolder, sharper, as though the wife's silence had given her permission to wound deeper. One afternoon, while the wife sat in the garden seeking a rare moment of peace, the mistress cornered her. Her words came like arrows, taunting her for being weak, for clinging to a marriage that was already lost, for believing that a child could ever keep a man like the millionaire loyal. "You're nothing more than a burden," she sneered, leaning close so that her venom would sink in. "Once the baby is born, he'll see what dead weight you are. You're finished." The words sliced through the wife's already fragile spirit, her hands trembling as she tried to shield her belly, as though protecting her child from the poison being poured into her ears. The pressure was too much. Her vision blurred, her breath quickened, and before she could call out for help, her body gave way. She collapsed onto the stone pathway, pain shooting through her as panic consumed her. The sound of her fall echoed across the courtyard, drawing servants and, finally, the millionaire himself. For the first time, he saw his wife not as a distant figure in the background, but as a fragile woman fighting to hold on to life, not just hers, but their child's. The drive to the hospital was a blur of sirens and shouts. The mistress stood frozen, her mask slipping as fear flickered across her face, but the millionaire barely noticed her. His hands shook as he sat beside his unconscious wife, the sight of her pale face and the small tremor in her fingers piercing him with guilt. At the hospital, the doctor's words struck him harder than any accusation could. The baby was in danger, they said, the stress and emotional trauma having weakened both mother and child. Any further strain could cost them both dearly. The millionaire felt his world tilt, the wealth and power he clung to suddenly meaningless in the face of what he might lose. For the first time, he saw the depth of the suffering he had ignored, the fragility of the woman who had once been his anchor. As he stood by her bed, watching her struggle to breathe steadily, his heart twisted with fear and regret. He realized with brutal clarity that he had been complicit in her pain, and now the consequences threatened not only her but the innocent life they had created together. The sterile white walls of the hospital seemed to press in on him, suffocating him with silence. The millionaire sat at his wife's bedside, his hand hovering uncertainly above hers, aching to touch yet afraid he had lost the right. Machines beeped steadily, each sound reminding him that her life, and the life of their child, hung in fragile balance. In the stillness, his mind betrayed him with memories he had buried beneath pride and selfishness. He saw her on their wedding day, eyes shining with devotion as she promised to stand by him no matter what storms came. He remembered late nights when she stayed awake, waiting for him with dinner, even when he returned hours late from work. He recalled the way she had defended him in front of critics, believing in his dreams when no one else did. She had always been loyal, always kind, always his quiet strength. And he had repaid her with neglect. The more he thought of the mistress, the clearer her image became. Her laughter was hollow, her affection a performance. She never looked at him with warmth, only calculation. Every word of comfort she had offered now sounded like manipulation, every touch like a bargain. She had wanted the mansion, the title, the prestige of being beside him. Love had never been part of her game, and he had been blind enough to trade the devotion of his wife for the empty promises of a woman who thrived on destruction. Guilt gnawed at him, relentless and sharp, as he sat hour after hour beside his wife. He tried to speak, to apologize, but she turned her face away, her silence colder than any words. The distance between them was a canyon he had carved with his own hands, and now he was left staring at the chasm, unsure if it could ever be crossed. He longed for her forgiveness, but in her refusal to look at him, he finally understood the depth of her wounds. For the first time, he feared not only losing her love, but losing her completely. The facade the mistress had so carefully built began to crack, not with a dramatic outburst but with the slip of a tongue sharpened by arrogance. She had grown too confident, too sure of her place, and one evening, as relatives and trusted business partners visited the mansion to inquire about the wife's health, she revealed more than she intended. At first, she played the role she knew so well, hovering near the millionaire, pretending concern, offering shallow reassurances about the wife's condition. But when one of the older family members quietly praised the wife's resilience and grace, the mistress scoffed, unable to hide her disdain. "Grace," she sneered. "That weak, pathetic woman can't even keep herself together. If she weren't carrying his child, she'd have been gone long ago. I've practically run this house myself while she's been falling apart." The words hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. Gasps echoed from the room, eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, the mask of sweetness the mistress wore shattered completely. The staff, emboldened by the slip, began whispering what they had long kept hidden, how she had ordered them to ignore the wife's instructions, how she had mocked her behind her back, how she had made life unbearable under the millionaire's very nose. Family members chimed in, recalling strange behaviors they had dismissed, now piecing together the truth of her manipulations. The millionaire stood frozen, every revelation cutting deeper. He watched her smirk falter, her charm dissolve as she realized she had exposed herself. The image of the woman he thought brought excitement now twisted into something grotesque, ambition without love, cruelty without remorse. His chest tightened as he understood the enormity of his mistake. While he had protected her, defended her even, his wife had been enduring silent torment, stripped of dignity in her own home. Betrayal washed over him, but it was not just the mistress's betrayal he felt, it was his own. He had chosen the wrong woman, shielded the wrong heart, and in doing so, had nearly destroyed the only person who had ever truly loved him. The walls of the hospital room were quiet, but inside the millionaire's chest there was nothing but chaos. When he finally entered, his steps were unsteady, stripped of the arrogance and certainty he once carried like armor. His wife lay propped against the pillows, her face pale but dignified, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the woman he had betrayed, the woman whose love he had squandered. Then, with a trembling breath, he dropped to his knees beside her bed. Tears blurred his vision as he reached for her hand but stopped short, afraid she would pull away. "I was blind," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I let her poison our home. I failed you, failed our child. I don't deserve even a glance from you, but I'm begging you, please, don't turn away forever." His words tumbled out in a rush, raw and desperate, the polished charm of a millionaire replaced with the humility of a man who finally saw his own ruin. His wife turned her face toward him slowly, her eyes unreadable. She said nothing, only tightened her hold on her belly, as though shielding the baby from the storm of his regrets. Her silence was heavier than any accusation, yet it forced him to pour out everything he had buried. His guilt, his shame, his recognition that wealth and power meant nothing compared to the love he had trampled. Kneeling there, his tears soaking into the floor, he realized the power had shifted entirely. No longer was she the one begging for his attention, his protection. Now he was the one desperate, his future dependent on her mercy. For the first time in his life, the millionaire was stripped bare, humbled before the woman he had once taken for granted. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes calm but carrying the weight of every wound he had allowed. His tears might have moved her once, but now they felt like too little, too late. Slowly, she drew in a breath and spoke, her voice steady though soft. "This is not about you anymore. It's about my child. Our child. I can't let myself break, not now, not when a life depends on me." Her hand pressed gently against her belly, the gesture one of fierce protection. He opened his mouth to speak again, but she shook her head, silencing him. "You chose to be silent when I needed you most. You let me stand alone while she tore me apart piece by piece. And now you kneel, but do you understand what that silence cost me? What it almost cost our baby?" Her words cut cleanly, not with anger but with truth, the kind that left no room for excuses. She did not forgive him, nor did she say she never would. Instead, she turned her face away, leaving him suspended in uncertainty. The echo of her strength lingered, forcing him to reckon with the devastation his silence had sown. The days that followed were a harsh mirror for the millionaire. The mistress, once so bold and charming, disappeared the moment her mask was torn away, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal. He had lost her, but in truth, she had never truly been his. What haunted him more was how close he had come to losing his wife and child, the only real treasures he had ever possessed. His empire, his wealth, the endless glitter of his lifestyle felt hollow when weighed against the silence of her rejection and the fragile sound of her breathing in the hospital bed. For the first time, he began to change. The arrogance slipped from his shoulders, replaced with humility and a relentless desire to make amends. He realized that love was not about conquest or appearances, and loyalty could never be bought with gifts or status. True love had been with him all along, in the quiet strength of the woman he had cast aside, the woman who had carried his child through torment with dignity. The wife, though wounded, chose not to let bitterness consume her. She poured herself into preparing for motherhood, her focus shifting from pain to the future she would build with her child. Her self-respect became her greatest strength, a shield that reminded her she was more than the cruelty she had endured. Their story did not end neatly with forgiveness, but with a lesson etched deep into both hearts. Betrayal could destroy trust in a moment, and love once broken could never be mended without true repentance. For him, regret was a daily companion. For her, dignity was her crown. And in that fragile balance, the possibility of redemption lingered, if he could ever prove himself worthy again.